Section 11.1, first part, new chapter. Yay, I love new beginnings. Here we go. Square root principle is if x squared equals a, then x must equal plus or minus the square root of a. So in other words, what we did was if you take the square root of both sides, the square root of x squared is just x. And then you can have, well, let's do it this way. So we know x squared, let's say 25 equals a. So a could be 5. A could be negative 5. So you can have plus or minus the square root. So that's what we mean by that. So let's do a couple. And I have the steps here. Step 1, you've got to isolate the squared variable. So if you had other things next to here and you tried to take the square root, then that makes a big mess. You have to have the squared term by itself. So once you have that by itself, then you just take the square root of both sides and then you simplify. And I didn't put in the steps. Make sure that you your answer is either plus or minus, because it could be that you've squared a negative term to get this. So first one, x squared equals 40. Well, to find out what just x is, in order to undo squaring, we're going to take the square root. They're opposites, just like adding and subtracting are opposites, or multiplying and dividing are opposites. Squared and square root are opposites. So we're just going to undo with a little square rooty thingy going on here. And then when you, so now x is plus or minus the square root of 40. Now when you do that, now we're going to simplify. And remember, I didn't give myself enough space, so I'm kind of squishing in here. So we know 40 is, well, let's see, let's do it over here. 40 is 4 times 10, and 4 is 2 times 2, and 10 is 2 times 5. So we've got 2 times 2 times 2 times 5. And so we've got a square root, so that's just 2 of them. So this set of 2's will come out. So we have plus or minus 2, and then the square root of 10 is left. All right? So this actually is 2 answers. It's either positive 2 square root of 10 or negative square root of 2 square root of 10. So this symbol is just plus or minus. It means we're going to do both, but we're going to kind of condense it. And this is just another symbol of that makes life easier for mathematicians. There we go. So plus or minus 2 square root of 10. All right, if you want x squared, how do you get negative 9? Well, we're going to take the square root. And so the square root of x squared is just x, and that equals the square root of negative 9. Well, here's the deal. Remember, negative 9 is negative 1 times 3 times 3. So we've got 3 coming out here, but we've got that square root of negative 1. Don't forget, you have a tool for that now. The square root of negative 1 is just I. So don't forget, it's plus or minus 3 square root of I. All right. See, don't forget, maybe put in your notes, don't forget plus or minus when you simplify. Don't forget plus or minus. All right. Okay, let's do another one, a little bit more difficult. Step 1 said to isolate the squared variable, and here we've got x squared plus 2 equals 100. So we've got to get that squared term by itself first. So what we're going to do is simply subtract the 2 from both sides. So x squared equals 98. So now we have the x squared by itself. We just take the square root of both sides. And so x equals, don't forget the plus or minus the square root of 98. So this is where you're going to look to see, well, 98 is actually 49 times 2, which is 7 times 7 times 2. So we can take a 7 out and keep the square root of 2. So x is equal to plus or minus 7, the square root of 2. All right. So really, you're going to be using a lot of things that we already used in the past chapter. So here we go. You can do this. Still, isolate the squared variable. So step 1 on this one is a little bit more complex, but you can do it, right? We're simply going to get the x squared term by itself by following the order of operations backwards. So subtract that 2 from both sides. So 5x squared now equals 60. We still have to get the x squared term by itself. So to do that, we have to divide by the 5. So now, and I usually like to go up and down. Let's move it over here. So we're going to go over here. So now dividing, and so we have just x squared equals 60 divided by 5 is 12. So now we're going to take the square root of both sides. That's the square root of both sides. So now the square root of x squared is just x equals, don't forget, plus or minus the square root of 12. And 12, remember, is 2 times 2 times 3. 2 times 2 is 4, and 4 times 3 is 12. So we can take out a 2 and still have the square root of 3 under there. All right, a lot of the same thing you just did in the last section, or in the last chapter. All right, now let's get a little bit more. It'll be a little bit scarier looking, but actually these are even easier. So what you've got going on here is this whole binomial is squared. All right, so my steps are a little bit misleading when I say isolate the squared variable. I guess I should say isolate the squared term. It could be just a variable. It also could be this whole binomial. So in order to get rid of the squared, you're going to have to take the square root of whatever was squared. And in this case, this whole x plus 6 is squared. So to undo this, I can't take the 6 away yet because this is squared. It all goes together. But if you take the square root of anything squared, you get right back to where you started, which will make life a lot easier. All right? So if you've got a binomial that's squared, don't get rid of anything. You can't. It all stays together. But you can get rid of the squared term by taking the square root of the whole thing. All right? So the square root of this and then the square root of the 49. So now we've got plus or minus, and 49 is 7 times 7. So plus or minus 7. Now we simply subtract 6. Now, this is where you've got to watch and be careful because this plus or minus 7 means 7 or negative 7. So when you get to this step and you continue to solve, you actually have two equations, all right? You have x plus 6 equals 7 or x plus 6 equals negative 7, all right? So don't forget to separate those out. If you've got this type where, okay, now you're adding or subtracting something, separate it out into two separate problems. So now when you subtract 6 here, now x is 1, or you're going to subtract 6 here from both sides, and now x is negative 13, because here you've got two negatives, and so if the signs are the same, you're going to add and use the sign. All right, so this one has two answers. They all had two answers, remember? But they were the same, just one positive and one negative. This one has two completely different answers. X is 1 or x is negative 13. All right, one more problem. It's going to be very similar to what we just did. So if you think you can go ahead, then that's fine. Go right ahead and see if you can work it on your own. Because this is another binomial squared. So if the whole binomial is squared, we can take the square root of the whole binomial. All right, so the square root of this whole binomial, the square root and the square cancel each other out, remember? So now we just have 5x minus 1 on this side of the equation, and that's going to equal, don't forget, it's plus or minus, square root of 10. 10 is 2 times 5, and there's nothing square about a 2 or a 5. All right, so we just have plus or minus the square root of 10, and it can just stay there. Now watch this, all right? This is going to look confusing to you, but it's actually easy because you just leave it. The hard part is going to be leave it. Don't do anything with it. Because now you have to get the x by itself. You want the x alone to know what is the value of x. So you're going to add 1 to both sides, and you'll say, yes, but this one is in a square root and this one is not. Good catch. I'm so glad you saw that. So 5x equals, you'll just have to sit it out there, 1 plus or minus the square root of 10. You just have to sit it there and it's okay. All right? And then you're going to divide by 5, and you'll divide the whole other side by 5. So now, when you reduce this down, this is your final answer, and you're finished. So x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 10 all over 5. And that's it. You're done. You will need to look to see if both of these terms can be divided by what's underneath it. You can split it apart and reduce those separately and then put it back together. But this one doesn't reduce. You're finished. And it's okay for it to look all crazy like that. That is the answer. 1 plus or minus the square root of 10 divided by 5. All right? So a lot of the same types of things that you did already with the square roots and pulling out pairs of things, don't forget the plus or minus. So your answer actually is 2 answers every time. If you don't have that plus or minus sign or 2 separate answers, then the answer is wrong. You've only got half your answer. Okay? So don't forget that. All right, good luck.